The demand was simple: votes for women. But the journey was far from easy. During the early 20th century, British women worked to convince their government and the public at large of the necessity for women's suffrage. That is, the importance of women having a vote. Because of their campaigning, these women became known as suffragists. As time wore on and the British government continued to ignore the issue of female voting, some women became deeply agitated and turned to militant or violent tactics. These women became known as suffragettes. The term, first used by the Daily Mail, was meant to make fun of female protesters. But the militants embraced the term and began to call themselves suffragettes. Over the next few years, peaceful suffragists and militant suffragettes would continue to demand the vote, sometimes facing great danger to do so. But why all this trouble? The British government had been expanding the vote through the 19th century, but continued to exclude women. The 1832 Reform Bill helped industrial and urban areas which had been underrepresented. Still, only 1 in 7 men were allowed to vote. In 1867, the electorate, that is, people eligible to vote, expanded to include working-class men in England and Wales. But what about women? The campaign for female enfranchisement gained visibility in the 1870s and 1880s. At first, the movement was rather small. Members were mainly educated, upper-class women and a handful of male reformers. But the idea that women should have a fair say in government gained traction. In 1884, it looked as though women may be granted the vote. The Representation of the People Act promised to bring fair representation to smaller towns and rural areas. Over 100 members of the Liberal Party had pledged to support the addition of female voters to the bill. But when it came time to vote, almost all the MPs who had promised to help women gain the vote backed out. Prime Minister Gladstone had spoken against women's enfranchisement, telling his fellow Liberals that its addition would only hurt the Reform Bill. The fight for political equality intensified after the turn of the century, with 3 organizations taking center stage. Though they all wanted the same thing, votes for women, their strategies were very different. First was the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, created in 1897. Led by Millicent Fawcett, the NUWSS favored peaceful, constitutional advocacy. They hoped to win the right to vote through pamphlets, letter writing, petitions, etc. The Women's Social and Political Union stood in sharp contrast. These women, known as suffragettes, were militants. They favored aggressive means of protest and demanded action on the part of the government. The WSPU was led by the infamous Mrs. Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters, Christabel and Sylvia. While the NUWSS was a democratic society, the WSPU was run like a tight military operation. The Pankhursts harbored a deep distrust of the Liberal Party after the disappointment of the Representation of the People Act, so the WSPU leaned towards the Conservative Party. The NUWSS thought it best to remain nonpartisan, choosing not to identify with any party. The two groups were often at odds. The WSPU thought the NUWSS was ineffective. The NUWSS thought the WSPU was scaring away potential supporters with their antics. Somewhere in between, you would find the Women's Freedom League. This organization was formed by ex-members of the WSPU who disagreed with the Pankhursts' violent tactics but understood their sentiment. The WFL described themselves as militant constitutionalists. This meant that they were willing to carry out extreme forms of protest and even go to prison for the cause, but drew the line at causing harm to others or property. These 3 organizations kept women's suffrage in the news and in the public consciousness. The movement became known the world over. Popular culture of the era latched on to the image of the suffragette, for better or for worse. The campaign for women's suffrage would inspire generations of activists. 60 years later, suffragists and suffragettes would be lauded as first-wave feminists. Even today, the suffrage movement remains relevant. This series will explore the ways in which women campaigned for the vote, how the public reacted to the campaign, and what life was like as a member of the women's suffrage movement.